Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Martin Andrews, Communication Director at Inquire Ed, and welcome to today's webinar, The Case for Elementary Social Studies District Leaders. We are so glad that you could join us today, and I see that we're still getting participants to come on in. So as everyone joins, I just want you to know that during the course of today's session, if you have questions or comments, please share them in the chat. I'm actually going to be there in the chat with you, so you can chat directly to me, and go ahead and chat directly to panelists and attendees so we can get a conversation going. Also, know that in a webinar like this, often we have some really great information that's shared, and we all want to get the book that somebody mentioned or the website or the resource. Never fear. On Friday morning, you'll receive a follow-up email from us with a link to a blog post that has a summary of everything we talked about, any resources we mentioned, and a video of the webinar. So you can feel free to share that out with others. The email will also include a link to request a certificate of attendance for those of you who would like one of those. For those of you just joining us, welcome. And I want to take a second and talk about this series that we've been running, The Case for Elementary Social Studies, because we've extended it on into the new year. And I wanted to tell you about 3 webinars that are coming up in 2021 now. Thank goodness 2020 is going to be in the past for all of us. But we have some really great webinars that I want to share about how you can make the case or the importance of elementary social studies. First of all, our first webinar is going to be in January, Social Studies in the Age of Disinformation. And we're so glad to be joined by Sam Weinberg, the head of the Stanford History Education Group, to talk about how elementary social studies and social studies in particular can prepare our students for this age that we are entering, where facts and ideas are most likely to be misrepresented, and we've seen that in the last year or so, even more. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to move on and talk specifically about tactics and strategies to develop media literacy in our elementary students through social studies. And then finally, a third webinar is going to look at mirrors in window using culturally responsive sources in the elementary social studies classroom. So you're not going to want to miss those great webinars. So you can head over to our website. We've just updated those so you can sign up for them now. This webinar series is part of a series that we co-sponsor with NCSS, the National Council for the Social Studies. It is the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education. It engages and supports educators in strengthening and advocating for the social studies. I was just on socialstudies.org today, and I'm really excited about a series that they're running that is called the Teach Different series. And it's a series of webinars and discussions with teachers about how to teach different with Sophocles, with Martin Luther King Jr., with Harriet Tubman. And you can go to their website, you can look at their professional learning opportunities, and you can find that Teach Different series. Please do that today. It seems like a great series, and you're going to want to sign up for that. The webinar series, of course, is also brought to you by Inquire Ed. Inquire Ed is an elementary social studies curriculum, inquiry-based curriculum company. We offer curriculum and professional development. Our elementary social studies curriculum is called Inquiry Journeys. And we like to say that we move beyond the textbook. We support culturally responsive instruction, inquiry-based teaching and learning. We align to national standards. We build up deep background knowledge and skills. I always like to tell a story of how our curriculum is being used in the classroom. We have a great 5th grade unit about Native America, past and present. And the inquiry question that students are exploring are, how can we better honor the cultural heritage of this land? And a 5th grade classroom in Ohio was exploring that inquiry question, building up their content knowledge through the lessons, through the investigations. And it got to that moment in all of Inquire Ed's inquiry journeys units where they could choose to take informed action. We have a lot of projects that we offer that teachers can implement with their students. But as they were building up content knowledge, the students, these 5th grade students, they were going into their library and they were exploring the sources that they found there. And what they found was that a lot of those books in their library were out of date. They contain historical inaccuracies, myths, and they brought them to their teacher and said, we have to do something about this. So they designed their own informed action project where they audited the books in their library to make recommendations to their teacher to label those books or to find a more updated and recent version of these sources that were accurate. And I love that example because it's a great example of a teacher following their students and their interests, and then students taking an investigation into a fascinating place for them. And I think that's an important part of all social studies classrooms. And I am going to turn this over to Shanti Ellen Govan. She is the CEO of Inquire Ed, and there she is. Shanti, I'm going to turn this whole thing over to you and disappear into the chat, and I'll let you introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate it. Well, I have the honor of getting to introduce this powerhouse panel that we have today. I'm so excited to be joined by the women on this panel. So first of all, I want to introduce, starting on the left over here, with Heather Van Thyssen, which I think I just messed up the end. I tried it, but Heather, forgive me for if I messed it up. As an educator for over 20 years, Heather has been a noteworthy leader in the civic learning and youth leadership space. She served as a teacher, instructional coach, instructional resource and professional development provider, and advocate for student voice and authentic experiential learning across grades and content areas. Today, she serves as the Director of Social Science and Civic Engagement for Chicago Public Schools. CPS leads the country in its innovations in and commitment to student voice and civic engagement, as well as culturally responsive sustaining curriculum and instructional guidance and training. Most notably, their Participate Civics program and their Say Their Names guidance has received national recognition. Thank you, Heather, for being here. Oh, I think Heather's still on mute. That's good.
Oh, I am here. Thanks for having me, Shanti. I'm excited to get the conversation going.
Thank you. Next, we have Tina Ellsworth from Olathe Public Schools in Kansas. Dr. Ellsworth currently serves as the K-12 Social Studies Coordinator for a suburban school district in Kansas, where she oversees content-specific professional development, curriculum development, revision, resource adoption for all social studies teachers in grades K to 12. She holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction and social studies education from the University of Kansas and currently serves on the National Council for the Social Studies Board of Directors. Thank you, Tina, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And next we have Ellen Gilchrist, the Executive Director in the Office of Social Studies for Detroit Public Schools. Ellen has been in the Executive Director of the Detroit Public Schools after serving in a few roles for Detroit. As a former middle school and high school social studies teacher, instructional coach for the District of Columbia Public Schools, a former Fulbright Scholar, and a fellow alum of Teachers College, Ellen brings a wealth of knowledge in both professional learning and social studies instruction to the students in Detroit. Thank you, Ellen, for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Good stuff. All right, well, we'll jump on in. I'd love to hear all of your districts. I know a little bit about all of your districts. And I think all of your districts have been thinking about what the state of social studies looks like right now. I'd love to hear a little bit about the past. Tell us about what the state of elementary social studies instruction has looked like in your district over the last few years. And I'm going to start with Tina, just because you're top left in my screen for this one. So we'll do the Zoom order here to start this one off.
That's what I get for turning on my camera first. Hi, everybody. I'm Tina Ellsworth, and I am the K-12 Social Studies Coordinator in Olathe Public Schools. And we have about 34,000 students in our district. We're the second largest in the state of Kansas, as Shanti had said earlier. And I've been in this role. This is only my 4th year. And so what we've seen is in our district, social studies is required in grades K through 12, which is really exciting because I know there's a lot of school districts where that's not the case. So we have separate curriculum for every single grade level. And over the past few years, we've been doing more to try to build in more inquiry-based strategies. We have a lot of teachers who are diving in, trying that out, and they're getting really excited at the level of engagement that's happening in class, as well as students' ability to critically think. I'll give more examples later as we kind of go through this conversation. And our new state assessment that is being piloted this year is all inquiry-based instruction, and it is required at the elementary level as well. So we're excited about integrating more primary sources into the conversation, more inquiry-based strategies, and hopefully culminating into students taking more civic action.
Thank you, Tina. Ellen, I'll kick it to you next. Tell us a little bit about what elementary social studies instruction has looked like in Detroit.
Great. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here with you today. So I came to this role 4 years ago under a new leader in our district. Detroit was in an interesting place, and we were coming out of state oversight, and we're really launching an entirely new district, actually, coming under out-of-state oversight. We became Detroit Public Schools Community District, and as part of that, we all saw our role to serve our students and our community that had been underserved and underrepresented for quite some time. We took that really seriously. When I came into the role, materials were incredibly outdated. We had materials that were 20 plus years old. If schools had materials, we really recognized a need for curriculum across the district that was aligned. We also did not have a lot of time allocated for social studies. And so we had what was required by the state, but what we saw in practice were teachers were really trying to address student social emotional needs, their ELA and their math minutes, followed then by science and social studies. It was really the last priority for teachers. And we found that especially in the elementary space, teachers actually hadn't been trained and prepared to teach in the model that we were hoping to see. So it was really clear pretty early into my tenure at the district that we would have a lot of work to do to change the mindset around teaching social studies and to really get the time and attention that my team felt our subject deserved.
Yeah, thank you. Heather, I'll kick it to you.
I should unmute myself first. Thanks, Shanti. So Chicago Public Schools, we've got over 400,000 students, and about 220,000 of those are in elementary. So we have 477 elementary schools. So there's not really one consensus about where we are overall with that many schools, but there are some trends I think I can speak to. And I see in the chat a question about what's required. So the state of Illinois has some requirements, and CPS has some requirements. Social science is required to be taught in elementary school, and we are under a minute structure. So 150 minutes in 5 a week, 300 minutes in 6-8 a week. And those minutes and how they're used vary by school. So there's a lot of inconsistencies on how social science is taught. You'll see some schools that have a full-on commitment to social science and it's really robust and they've got a team and everything. And then you see minutes being met in social science through programs like advisory, right? Where every teacher is a social science teacher and they meet social science by reading a Scholastic magazine. And so, that is I think a broad spectrum issue that we find ourselves as a district that we're facing head on. I'll definitely be real with you all about our current state, because I think that what we struggle with is what the rest of the country struggles with when it comes to the marginalization of social science. And a lot of teachers feel the pressure, right, to spend more time on ELA and math than they do on social science because of tests like in Illinois, it's NWEA is what our schools are really focused on. And that what's unique about Chicago that might surprise a lot of you, and I was a teacher in CPS for 12 years, I taught high school. And we've never had a district curriculum. So every school and every teacher is kind of, it's up to them, which is something that we're actually remedying and addressing now, which I'll speak to later. But I think overall, what has really helped, and more about our current state, is that our state developed new standards a few years ago in response to C3, which was really powerful, and we're really engaged with those standards. We're also part of the state committee that is working on an anti-racist lens to our standards, so bringing in culturally responsive and sustaining perspectives to those standards. And then we're part of some working groups that our state is leading to really focus on thinking about Black history specifically, and how we teach history of marginalized groups and peoples, and the ways in which policy can help to shape and impact what gets taught in classrooms. And so in CPS, we do have some experience with that. For the last 5 years now, we launched and have been training teachers in a curriculum called Reparations 1, which is a response to actually a municipal code as a part of a reparations package. And it's about policing and police violence and systemic racism. And so teaching that unit and training teachers in that space has really helped to shape our current vision for social science and what we're trying to do today. But I am, really proud to say that we have some really innovative schools and teachers that have been leading the way to help to design what our current vision is for social science, which we are launching this year. And a lot of that has been shaped by our work in civic learning and civic engagement as well. So right this year, we've launched a new curriculum and training program called Participate Civics, which is focusing on like a contemporary US history and civics lens in 8th grade.
Thanks, Heather. Heather, you kind of took us to thinking about the vision of what social studies instruction might look like. And I'd love for you, the three of you, to really dream big here and think about, what do you wish social studies instruction would look like? What do you hope it looks like? What is the vision for what it looks like 3 to 5 years from now? And Ellen, maybe I'll start with you on this one, if that's okay.
Absolutely. We are in the phase of really dreaming big and beginning to build it out. It's an exciting time at the district. We started this work 2 years ago, really redesigning our social studies program. And we started in the secondary space for a number of reasons, looking at material audits and what we have, and then taking a really slow approach to introducing curriculum district-wide. And by that, I mean, rather than rolling out an entirely new curriculum for all of our teachers at once, we started with supplemental materials that were aligned to our vision of excellent instruction that we developed my first year. And so with that as our North Star, we looked at materials and brought teachers in to review them and began training teachers on the vision and what inquiry instruction looked like in social studies, and slowly asking them to change their practice using these new materials. Poor timing would have it, we rolled out new core materials this year in our secondary space. So it's been challenging on a number of fronts because most of our students and teachers are not learning in person right now. But we started in that space. And then we moved into elementary school, really taking into consideration where all of our elementary school teachers were. We because of where we were as a district in that unique place, we've been presenting new curriculum in every subject area over the last few years. And so we wanted our elementary school teachers to be able to breathe. Often, they are self-contained and they're teaching everything, and getting 4 subjects of new materials is daunting at best. And so we, again, are taking that slow approach of introducing materials in stages, and are really excited to be partnering with Inquire to put materials into our schools in the fall with an intensive program on select schools to really build teachers' capacity. And in terms of how we look at these materials, so we have our vision, which is our North Star internally. We've aligned teacher evaluations, so everything is aligned to that vision for instruction. That then is aligned to our state standards and what we are asked of them. But we have a few other unique things, and Heather spoke to some of this as well. Our school board adopted an anti-racist proclamation, and that is becoming a thread of all that we are doing, really making sure that our city is represented in our materials. Detroit is a city with a fascinating history, and we want our students to learn it and to take great pride in that, and take great pride in themselves. And we are really striving, especially in the elementary space, to make sure that that representation is there. We have also been really thinking about the time and how we find the time to teach social studies. In secondary, that was easy. It's allocated, it's there, they have it daily. Elementary school was a lot more challenging. And we didn't strike out a home run the first time. In fact, I think we might have struck out. We tried doing more of an integrated approach with our ELA curriculum, but we found that social studies was just sort of like falling by the wayside with that approach. And all the stars happened to just sort of start to align. And moving into this school year, it was really clear from our community, our parents and broader stakeholders in the city, that there was a need to have more direct social studies instruction taught, and more of the social studies skills that we would like to see being covered. And we really capitalized on that, and pushed and made the ask of all of the people at the table to make shifts so that we could have a lot more dedicated social studies time in the elementary space, K4. And starting in 5th grade, we already had that required daily. And with that, we found teachers that they became excited. They started coming to us and asking us for help and showing up at PDs, and really expressing that they hadn't done much in a while. And so now we are in this really unique place. We have the instructional minutes, we have the vision, we have the buy-in and the support from our district. And so now we have to deliver on it. Is really where we are as a district.
Ellen, I want to ask you one follow-up question, because there's a question that kind of speaks to this in the chat. Jerry Price asks, can you speak to how you've gotten traction to include social studies in an environment where elementary teachers often are asked to focus on reading and math? Have research addressing content knowledge, literacy, and social studies content provided any leverage? And I specifically, you spoke to this idea of using content-rich literacy programs, and you all in Detroit use a program that I have a lot of respect for, Yale's ELA curriculum. And I think, but you spoke on this idea of where it provides some leverage, and then maybe where it was falling short in terms of social studies, and why the push, and maybe how you got that push to happen.
Yeah, so as you said, we use EL, and we were really hoping to do some deep alignment and to cover a lot of our social studies instruction through our EL curriculum. And what we found was, by nature of the curriculum and how it is written, students were getting broad exposure to topics in history, but not the deeper skills that we would like to see when we think about the inquiry process. And we think about the economics and the geography and all of the social studies skills that we really want our students to learn. And we tried for 2 years to really let that be where our social studies lived, but it was falling short. How we got teachers to really buy into it and get some excitement and feel inspired to teach it were a few things happened simultaneously. So one, COVID came, and everybody had to find a new way to teach. And so teachers were willing to reach out and ask for help. And we really worked hard to make sure that our materials were easy and accessible and aligned and were able to share something that teachers felt like they would be excited about. And because of COVID and how it has impacted, especially early in COVID, our community here in Detroit, we were hit very hard. We were able to tie that into our materials and engage our teachers in a really powerful way. And so there was some relational buy-in that came about because of that. The other piece that happened is we really strategically started working with certain schools and certain teachers and having them share their experiences with what we were doing. I think the final piece was really, we actually had nothing to do with this, and it was just by luck of, all the stars aligned. But as we saw COVID sort of just rip through the city of Detroit really early, and as we saw the racial tensions escalating in our country and in our community here, there was a real desire to figure out how do we teach about these things. And we had been doing a lot of the work so that we were primed to give people sort of what they needed in that space. And that went up the ladder as well, right? We were able to say, like, if we don't teach social studies now, then when, right? Like, if we don't help kids understand what's happening in their worlds, why they're at home, why they can't visit people, who has the power to make these decisions. If we can't do that now, then we're failing them, and that's not what we're here to do. And that was really well received and by our superintendent, by our school board, and everybody really coalesced around that. And so we really have been capitalizing on that.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Appreciate it. Tina, I'd love to hear from you in really thinking about what this vision looks like 3 to 5 years from now. And also, I think Ellen spoke to this idea of a moment right now in terms of thinking about social studies. And so I'm curious about how that moment looks in your district right now, and then just largely more what the vision looks like.
And I don't know about you all, but I've already taken like copious notes on what these other two districts are doing. So thank you so much for sharing. Our district just underwent a new strategic plan. And a part of the strategic plan is social emotional health of students. And that includes cultural competence, cultural sustainability, those types of things that are really important to the well-being of our students. And also with the increase of more kind of self-reporting data from organizations like Panorama that create these questions that you can ask kids that kind of gauge their social emotional health. And one of them is like a sense of belonging. Do students feel like they belong? And then do you find any differences in student responses based on demographic characteristics, if you will? And when you really dig in there and you look and you start to see that maybe students of color don't feel as connected or don't feel like they belong in the same way that white students do, then you start to go, okay, what can we do more? And one of the biggest things is greater representation in the curriculum of students of all different backgrounds, right? So part of our strategic plan really starts to tackle that for the social emotional health, but also for a student's own cultural competence. I mean, we know that our world is becoming more diverse. The United States is no exception. By 2040, it's predicted that there will be no single racial group that will make up the majority of the country. And so if that is true, then we need to be really intentional about getting to know one another, know each other's histories, have greater respect for each other's similarities and differences and honoring them and making sure we have a place for them. So when we're getting ready to do our adoption for elementary, for new curriculum and for new resources in the next couple of years. And I will be very excited to get together with a team of teachers who are committed to providing those doors and windows, or windows and mirrors rather. The kids can see themselves in the curriculum, but then they can also see into the lives of other people. And I think that's going to be really critical, leading with inquiry and letting kids know that you can ask your own questions and we can go find our own answers to those questions, and not being afraid to put real life issues in front of them that they can then go and act on, even if it is in your school building. So when we were I was talking to a 5th grade teacher in our district And she had me come in and observe her kids, and they were discussing a public policy issue in their school, which is, should we offer chocolate milk in our building? And so students were curious about this. They started to investigate the price. They investigated how much money was made, which they found was not very much. They looked at, did it satisfy kids' needs? So we get into economic decision making, right? But then as they look at those things, then they can create an argument for whether or not we should have it. And then they engaged with the principal and gave their arguments about whether or not we should offer this sugary drink in our schools and whether or not it's good for kids. Well, a lot of times people just see those things in ELA. And that's kind of where it stays, is just making that argument. And I'm like, how can we really hone in on the fact that you did economic decision making, you engaged in civics by promoting a position on a policy issue that will change your school, and really empowering kids to see they can make a difference. A few years ago, I was at an NCSS conference and I heard somebody, the title of their session was something like Citizens Now, Not Later. And a lot of times we approach citizenship as something we're preparing kids for later, for when they turn 18, because the penultimate example of engaging in your citizenship is voting. When really that shouldn't be it. That shouldn't be our goal. Oh, you voted, you don't have to do anything else for the next 4 years, at least relative to a general election. But how do we get kids to understand they're citizens right now? They can make a difference in their world right now. So I'm looking for things definitely that are going to be inquiry-based. They're going to be more primary source-based, helping kids understand different types of evidences and what they say. And the little teaser we had at the beginning that talked about Sam Weinberg with that civic online reasoning and this age of disinformation, how we can help students start to navigate that space now. I've got a first grader and a second grader at home, and we talk through, is this thing believable or not? And they're certainly able to answer some of those questions, but ultimately looking for things that will prepare kids for advocacy and for engagement. We want the learning to be meaningful to them, relevant to them, things that raise their social political consciousness. They can go running home and say, I can engage with you about this topic, about taking care of the earth. You know, when my daughter comes home and she's like, I want to go pick up trash. I'm going to go find trash because I feel a calling, and I thought that would be fun to talk to my parents about. But having more perspectives that are more inclusive, flipping the script a little bit, instead of having an ELA block where we teach social studies content, have a social studies block where we can teach some ELA skills. So I think thinking about how we can flip that script a little bit, and somebody mentioned like some studies that are out there. Fordham in September had a really great piece on the impact of a lack of elementary social studies on literacy skills. And so anytime I get things like that, I always push it out to people in the literacy world and go, what can we do? And so my ELA counterpart in elementary, we're going to get together and we're going to start talking about how can we really fuse these together in a way that's meaningful, that doesn't water down social studies. Because I think a lot of times that happens, that's pretty pervasive, I think, across the country. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tina. Yeah, I have to just echo I love what you said about flipping that idea. We always approach it with, let's start with ELA or math and then put something else into that. And I think that idea, flipping that idea, really is really resonates with me. Thank you. Heather, I'm going to kick it to you to tell us a little bit about what's happening in my hometown of Chicago.
Yeah, I love this question too of visioning 5 years from now, 3 to 5 years from now. So thank you for that, because I would much rather talk about that than the current state. So no, just kidding. But I think there's a trend, right? A lot of new visions coming out, a lot of new strategies coming out. And I think that's in response to, in a lot of ways, leadership like C3 and some of the research that has been coming out. So I can't emphasize enough just how important that is, that story and that perspective is elevated, and those kind of things have been shaping a lot of our vision. So we're launching a new district vision, and that will be coming out and trickling out over the next coming months. It's revolving around 4 core areas. So the first core area is culturally responsive and sustaining education. And so that is a heartbeat throughout all of the rest of the core areas. The second one is inquiry, obviously, and the third is disciplinary literacy. So teaching through those core social science disciplines of history, of economics, of civics, and really making sure that thematic approach happens, right? That the thematic shifts happen. And then finally, the powerful practices. Powerful practices really lean on how do we focus on the skills, habits, and dispositions of democratic participation that may help students be powerful in our world today. And I think that that's what's critical too when we're talking about other content areas, because yes, the emphasis is on literacy and it is on math, and in our district it also is on science, and STEM is a really big deal. And what's been really exciting about a lot of these disciplines is that you start seeing some shifts for themselves, right? Like they're focusing on culturally relevant texts, they're focusing on meaningful and experiential learning, they're focusing on student voice within their content area. But what's I think important to name is that without the disciplines of social science, that a lot of that work is just tokenistic, because students need to understand history, they need to be thinking about policy, they need to understand systems and structures. Like all of that core learning that happens in social science is critical and foundational, not just for reading development, which we know, right? Students need content and context to grow in reading. So social science is critical there, but social science is critical for preparing young people as powerful and engaged civic actors. And so all of these things, which I think are powerful sea changes we're seeing, like NCTE just announced their conference to be predominantly, I think, about equity and race next year. And so these changes are really critical, but the foundational knowledge happens in social science. So in 3 to 5 years, we are aiming to see a dramatic shift for the role in which social science is positioned in elementary school. So like students' identities and leadership are at the forefront of teacher and administrative planning. And they're constantly thinking about how are we centering students' lived experiences? How are we elevating their perspective in all aspects of our classroom learning, but also school-wide learning? And an emphasis on protected time for social science. Like we will expect to see parents, teachers, and not just social science teachers, English teachers, math teachers, science teachers, arts, everybody saying social science is important. We need to prioritize this. We need to think about this and where our scheduling goes and where we're pulling out students. Because, you know, it's at the point where these kind of things have to be a community effort. If we're going to stop and pause and look at the state of our democracy, look at the state of our communities, that this has to be a collective effort and it cannot just be championed by social science teachers. But I will also say that admin and district leadership is critically important. I see some questions about how do you get, you know, them to have buy-in. District leadership is critically important. So Dr. Jackson in our district is a former social science teacher and a huge advocate for that. And that really goes far, but also I think local and national leaders and folks like Inquire Ed putting these panels together are another example of how we start helping people to see what social science actually really is. Because another thing is that in 3 to 5 years, I'm gonna have to stop explaining what social science instruction is, because a lot of folks are still living in the past. So we're still seeing like the march through history, heroes and holidays. You know, I can't teach this, I can't do inquiry because they don't have enough foundational knowledge about this moment in history. So in 3 years, we're going to see a lot less of that and more of these 4 core areas that we're aiming for. And then I think finally, community-based projects that are rooted in social science content. So we are launching a new framework called Inquiry to Action, and it's across all content areas, but really emphasizing in social science, because we see that as like the gateway drug, especially for teachers that are a little bit nervous about inquiry, or thematic teaching feels like it takes too much time because we have to get to all this content and all these skills. That engaging in projects like this really help folks to see that the content and the skill development happens over time and students are deeply engaged, deeper learning is happening. And what's more important, they're learning about and developing their identities at the same time. And I think that that's what we cannot underestimate or undervalue about these important shifts that we're naming in social science. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Heather. I got to tell everyone that I got a little sneak peek at that new social science framework, and this is a jam-packed document. So when it goes public, please check it out. It is a lot of good stuff in there in a couple of pages. I was pretty amazed by how much you guys got in there in a couple of pages. So congrats on that document, Heather. I'm sure it's been a Herculean effort. I want to talk a little bit. You've all spoken about instructional materials and things that are supporting. You know, I spend my days thinking a lot about how we support teachers in making these shifts in instructional practice. I think a lot about the fact that when we're talking about culturally responsive, inquiry-based instruction, these are huge shifts in practice in the classroom, and that we can't just say, get there. You know, that's not how it works. There was a study I was reading today from Rand called Preparing Children and Youth for Civic Life in the Era of Truth Decay. And in this, the teachers reported that high quality instructional materials are scarce and even sometimes hinder their efforts to promote student civic development. So I'm wondering if you all can just respond to that idea of instructional materials and thinking about how we support teachers in the classroom and making these shifts in instruction, and what the role might be for instructional materials. What should they be doing? What should they look like? And how is it that they are hindering what is happening in terms of civic development? Heather, I'll actually start with you this time around.
Yes, and can you repeat it? Because I was responding in the chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah, totally.
Panels of Zoom panels.
No, I'm glad you're chatting with our folks. That's way more important. So in this report from Rand called Preparing Children and Youth for Civic Life in the Era of Truth Decay, teachers reported that high quality instructional materials are scarce in social studies and even sometimes hindering their efforts to promote student civic development. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of respond to that and just speak a little bit about what instructional materials should be doing in terms of supporting teachers in this work.
Yes. Okay, good. I'm glad I asked you to repeat the question. Such an important question. I think it's the important question. My teaching background was in English. And I think that similar to social science, curriculum and content materials are so critically important. But when it comes to the instructional shifts that we're all naming, right? So every panelist that you've heard here talking about inquiry and culturally responsive education, I want to name first that underneath that all is the teacher's identity, right? So who we are and what we bring to the classroom is first and foremost the most important. And in Chicago, we have predominantly white teachers teaching predominantly students of color. So we cannot ignore that. But also that the way we came up in school and how we learned how to do school, how we learned how to do social science is part of who we are. So we are naming not just instructional shifts, but also content knowledge shifts, dispositional shifts, value shifts, decentering whiteness, that all of those things are really critically important. And it's a huge load to put on teachers, especially during a pandemic, right? And so, which is part of what this launch has been, what we've been trying to do is really think about and emphasize how can curriculum help to drive some of these shifts that we're talking about, right? And so we have learned a lot over the years, and I think a few things that I can highlight is first that curriculum and those curricular materials can and should drive the kind of reflections that teachers need to do about themselves and their students at the same time as they're asking students to do that, right? That curriculum should position and can position students and teachers as co-learners through the inquiry. So those curriculum and the curricular materials can be really good places where we see that outcomes are not constant, right? That sometimes we'll have different answers to these questions. And then if we're doing it right, we're getting to the complexity of these questions and the complexity of these topics. And there's going to be varied perspectives brought in. And there's a lot of different folks that do this really well. Like I'll shout out Inquire Ed. Like, I mean, honestly, like you guys have got those that through that inquiry and that culturally sustaining lens down pat. We love Facing History. We partner with them and we're developing curriculum with them right now. But I think what I'll emphasize that's important to name is that curriculum in social science particularly has to be local, right? Like learning about general history or learning about general society only goes far as if we can contextualize it with our students' lived experiences and help them connect to it. And so some of the things that we've done, especially like civics resonates with me a lot, is that we developed our own civics curriculum because there isn't really a civics curriculum that can fit the needs of everybody everywhere. So we developed Participate, which is for Chicago's youth. And we've learned so much, not just about how much students have responded and been engaged and like really done powerful things through the curriculum, but how our teachers through the training program and using the curriculum has really shifted their thinking about instruction in their other content areas as well, right? And so I think finally, I will say that there's some really powerful, we have a rubric that we developed, which I'm happy to share with folks, a curriculum rubric, which is an anti-racist lens. And we're really grateful Dr. Goldie Mohammed assisted us on that. So it's really good. But we're really leaning heavily on that because this is a journey for everybody. And I want to encourage everyone to really do some critical analysis of the content they use, to question whose perspectives are brought into the classroom, to think about how are we elevating marginalized voices, how are we bringing multiple perspectives, how are we looking at different approaches to teaching about the Revolutionary War, for example, and whose stories are told through that lens. So the best curriculum, the best materials can help to drive that thinking and to drive those conversations, especially when we're bringing in so many isms with us and our own choices can't be trusted because we have to do our own reflection on our biases.
Yeah, I think a lot about, we speak about our curriculum a lot, is that you need to add and stir. If the curriculum is complete before students' voices and students' context are presented, then there's no way you can be inquiry-based or culture responsive. If you turn the page and the answer is on the next page, I don't care how many questions you put on that page before, it's not inquiry-based, it's not culture responsive, it's not supporting culture responsive practice. So it's that student activation that I think is required in those instructional materials that you're speaking about, Heather. Thank you, Heather. Tina, I'll kick it to you now.
And I know we're running low on time, so I'm just going to say Heather said everything that I was going to mention. And the only thing that I would add to that would be, I just would really want to amplify that she said that I had down. My first point is that the resources have to build the capacity of the teacher. Even if it's an inquiry-based curriculum, let's say, and even if it's not necessarily contextual, which we already talked about why that would be problematic, if they can't go through an inquiry-based lesson and not come out on the other end, be able to create their own that they can use inside of their own context, then I would say it's insufficient. Also making sure that we have diverse voices at the table, not just for designing curriculum, but for choosing those sources, making sure that it's not just a table of white educators. Bring in parents, bring in students. They're the largest stakeholder and sometimes have the smallest amount of voice in what it is that they're learning about. So I'll just add those two pieces.
Thank you, Tina. And Ellen, you get the last word before we go to audience Q&A. And audience, please go ahead and add questions. I know there's been some in there, but please add more as Ellen's finishing up.
And I would echo what Tina and Heather said. We have found that the best materials without actually teaching our teachers how to use them fall flat and create actually a lot of frustration around teaching social studies and a lot of hesitation and nervousness. And so really thinking about how you make the materials accessible to the person who's standing in front of kids and gets kids really excited about it. And if it's not accessible to our teachers, then our kids are really going to struggle to love it, no matter how great the materials are. I think your point, Tina, about bringing kids into the table is really powerful. We just went through curriculum adoptions and had our materials with students all around the district and giving them the opportunity to weigh in. It's always really eye-opening to hear, the things that kids pick apart and what they like and what they don't like and what they want to see more of and what's not working for them currently. And without that, I think our best laid plans, often fall short. I think the other piece, I guess, going back to like the original question of why the materials are so important, there's a lot we're trying to do with materials. And so when we can for us in a district, we are large, but we have a lot of catching up to do to really get to where we want to be. We find that those materials are really like people's lifeline, right? When we give them to people, they feel like they have some common ground to stand on, right? And they have colleagues that they can now lean on because they're using the same thing and they're not like alone on their island. And so I think that's what materials bring. But without teachers understanding what we're putting in front of them and what we're asking to do, the best materials can go back to the way we don't want teachers using them. And so that's my final thoughts on that.
Thank you. I think some of the questions we answered, it looks like. So if others have questions, please add them. I've got a question about how can we build capacity? So how do we build the capacity of teachers in really thinking about, so you talked about the instructional materials. Carnegie recently released a report talking about curriculum-based professional learning. So there's curriculum components, so there's just general capacity of teachers and supporting them in making these shifts. If you could all, anybody want to jump in first on this one?
Yeah, I can. I actually wanted to mention this earlier. This is a core part of our vision, is that, and it's actually a part of our, as a district, we just redesigned our instructional core. So if you're familiar with Elmore's, triangle of instructional core, we revised that to center identity, community, and relationships, but also develop continuous learning on the outside. So I think the question around building teachers' capacity has to fundamentally be anchored in how do we elevate and re-professionalize teaching in the first place? Because teachers' time is largely not conducive to them meeting with teams and observing each other and critically analyzing their own curriculum and engaging with students and lesson studies and doing peer observations and really doing their own research and interrogation on practice and curriculum is just not a way in which teaching functions anymore. And that's a huge problem. That's a shift that we're making in the district. And proud to say that our social science team is leading the way in that. They're doing what we learning cycle right now. We have our own framework for cycles of learning that teachers are doing in their teams. And I think that that's fundamentally the first part about building capacity, is looking at what are the systems and structures that exist in a school building and in the district to elevate teacher expertise and voice. The second thing we're focusing on is the pipeline, because there are tons of teachers. I mean, I was talking to some of them last night, such inspiring teachers that are doing incredible things right now that we learn from every day. How are we elevating them and providing them the space? Like, how do we keep really good teachers in the classroom, but also give them a leadership role? Because oftentimes if teachers want a leadership role, then what happens? They leave the classroom, they go become a principal or something else. And that's not what's best for students. So we have a pipeline called Educating for Democracy Fellows, where we have part of our budget we allocate to give teachers stipends to inform policy, lead PD, lead trainings, open their classroom for observations, those sorts of things. And that's something we're trying to do right now, because really, like, none of these shifts we're talking about, I think, are ever going to take hold unless it's led by teachers. Like, they're not, oh, the district has a new vision, great. Like, they don't care. They want to know what are teachers doing and how can they help to lead this movement and help to shape it is what matters the most.
I was going to add that letting the teachers shape it. I think a lot of times when things are done to them and without them, it falls flat. It feels disconnected. Sometimes administrators have been out of the classroom for too long. And things are shifting and moving, and the world is changing, and the way students are learning is changing. So really not just making sure they're at the table, but letting them lead, letting them guide. Like you can provide some kind of facilitation in the same way that we talked about, we wanted teachers to be co-learners with students. Well, sometimes district level folks need to kind of practice what they preach and go, we need to be co-learners with the teachers too. And so what are some things that we might bring to the table that maybe they hadn't thought about, or what are things that they're bringing to the table, and how can we create this thing together? And it goes back to what somebody said earlier about reprofessionalizing them, especially in a world right now where they feel really devalued with all the politics surrounding COVID and whether or not buildings are open or closed and what's happening. And so I think honoring them, and honoring their expertise and elevating their voice. And yeah, we need teacher leaders in the classroom, not necessarily just to leave and go be administrators.
Ellen, any thoughts on this?
I would echo what everyone else has already said. I think building those unique opportunities that make people feel acknowledged and recognized for the hard work that they're doing, and giving them the opportunity to share that. And sometimes it's really simple, right? It's the superintendent's shout out, or whatever your district email is, or little things that make people feel like, oh, I'm doing something good. And it's seen, but then it makes other folks wonder, like, what is it that so-and-so is doing? And other times it's more strategic and thoughtful. I mean, I think of some of the initiatives that we've started and are going to be trickling into social studies in the upcoming year around teacher leaders that are in the schools, but really taking on curriculum leads. We bring our teachers in to help us develop curriculum and write and model to lead PD because they can share far more insight than we can. And on the flip side, I think, so that speaks to what Tina was saying about like giving people the opportunity to have the voice and allowing us to learn from them. But for teachers, what we hear from them all the time is in doing that, they feel seen and they feel heard and they feel valued. And that makes them want to stay. And that's really important.
Thank you. I want to end with, I saw a lot in the chat asking for resources, and I'm reminded of the role of most of the people on this webinar today, the attender, or in similar roles to you all. And so I'd love for you to end with just your advice for them. If they're trying to get social studies instruction off the ground, if they've been in districts where social studies, like in most districts, has been completely marginalized, especially at the elementary level, what's your, 1 minute set advice, in 1 minute set of advice for them? Tina, I'll start with you.
Oh man, that's so, and it's such a big, gigantic question. I think, one of the things that we think about for elementary schools is going back to that mirrors and windows concept of the books that we're reading. And the National Council for the Social Studies has a great notable trade books list that's published every summer. And so if you're a member of NCSS, you can get your hands on that. And it's vetted by several social studies professionals around the country that would say, this one does a really great job at this and this. And so if you're really looking for some really rich sources that open up the perspectives, that could be a really great place to start, especially if you're in a place where maybe social studies isn't taught as much, doesn't have, or is more marginalized as far as the number of minutes. That could be a really great way that you can at least start to introduce those myriads of perspectives and teach some social studies content as well. There's a lot of great C3 work on c3teachers.org. It's all free and they're all inquiry-based lessons using one particular model. The inquiry design model is not the only model that you can use, but if you're looking for maybe some lessons, you're not really sure how to do this, or you don't know how to find primary sources, that could be a great place to start and getting your feet wet and learning how to have kids ask questions, find their own answers. And I think it does a good job of helping to build teacher capacity to go, oh, I could create something like this, or I could let my students have a say in what kinds of things they would like to investigate.
I will make a plug. I think the next 4 of our webinars are all about source evaluation. thinking about lateral reading with Sam Weinberg and the age of disinformation, thinking about what a scaffolding towards lateral reading looks like at the elementary level, source selection. So we're doing a lot of work around that. So please ask your teachers to join us for those webinars as well and sign up for those. There is one question, Heather and Ellen, before I turn to you for this question, there was a question in the chat about, this is a Midwest panel. I guess Inquire Ed, a Midwest company, was a little biased there. But usually the bias goes the other way to the coast. So we'll be okay with our Midwest bias. But do you all have a perspective on how different regions of the US are addressing these questions? Is there a rural versus urban divide? And Heather or Ellen, if either of you feel like you have a thought on that. Heather, you're nodding your head. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Ellen. Sorry. You look very
There's
well.
absolutely a rural and urban divide. Like, Illinois is like, I've done PD in Southern Illinois and put my foot in my mouth left and right. Like, it's not the same. The challenges are the same, are different. The perspective is different. I will say there's some folks who I think are doing interesting research in this area. I think well, actually, who stands out as a non-traditional ed space is Citizen University. It's not a specific ed group, but they are doing some really interesting programming of trying to create conversations in places like, I think, if you like a red state that might be resistant to phrases like culturally sustaining education and some of that, how those things have been politicized right now. But yeah, I am born and raised on the south side of Chicago, so it's definitely not something I think I can have any expertise to offer, but I do think that starting with who your allies are in as many ways as you can to engage your community and having these conversations and doing visioning of what we look for and what we expect, I think are critical. I know it's time, I'll stop.
No, okay. Ellen, I'll give you the last word.
I would actually take what Heather said to both questions. So my 1 minute piece of advice and then that divide, we live in Michigan. And so similar to Illinois, there is that serious divide. We ask our kids, we in Detroit say we are just going to authentically be who we are and teach the students we have. And sometimes that's well received and sometimes people probably have a problem with that. But we feel it is important that our kids see themselves in their histories and their materials and in everything that they do and what their teachers are prepared to talk about. And that we are preparing them for the world. And the truth, from my perspective, is how our students are often perceived and entering the world is a little different than a kid in a different community. And so it shouldn't all be the same. So I think in some ways that divide is healthy because it's preparing kids for what they need. And so my piece of advice and what would I say is to take advantage of your community. I know money and resources are often tight, and that is something we kind of haven't talked about in this space when we're trying to get materials and resources and things, and there's never enough of that to go around. But what we have found here is that some of our best partners are community organizations and activists and people who are deeply committed to our community, and tapping into them has helped me and my team so much. Has helped us learn things we didn't know about our city, our history, what's happening. But they've also been so generous, local museums and institutions, when we need access to things, have been willing to step up and stand in for our students. And so I think sometimes we think we have to have the money and to buy the big things, and that's not always true. And so look to what you have in your backyard would be my piece of advice.
Thank you so much, Ellen, Heather, and Tina. It's really been an honor to spend this hour with you. I wish we were spending 3 hours together, but we could keep going for a while. Thank you all for your work that you're doing in your districts and your communities. I'm forever grateful for the work that you all are doing. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to our audience for engaging with our panelists today. And we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.